Hello and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean for Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. Today's episode is a recording of another event in the Southern New Hampshire University's History Speakers Series, which brings professional historians, students, faculty, and staff together to talk about research projects, new publications, and history-related careers. At this event, Dr. Margaret MacDonald discusses her professional and academic career, her advocacy work as a public historian, and her research on Carolyn Beatrice Parker, the first black woman known to receive an advanced degree in physics, and who worked on the Dayton Project, which was part of the Manhattan Project during World War II. Gather around, everybody. Let's listen in. We're talking with Dr. Peggy Macdonald. Dr. Macdonald is a public historian and adjunct professor. She has taught at Southern New Hampshire University, Stetson University, Indian River State College, and the University of Florida, where she received her Ph.D. in history. A native Floridian, Dr. Macdonald has written about local and Florida history for Forum Magazine, Gainesville Magazine, Our Town Magazine, and Senior Times. In 2014, the University Press of Florida published her book, Marjorie Harris Carr, Defender of Florida's Environment. So first off, Peggy, thank you for joining us. And what more can you tell us about yourself beyond what I just read off in that bio there?
I always knew when I was a kid that I wanted to be a writer. When I grew up, I just didn't realize I wanted to be a historian. And I used to think that as an undergraduate student that history would be such an impossible major. I knew some people who were history majors. I was actually a theater and journalism major, and I couldn't wrap my mind around it. So it wasn't until later, after I had my first child, when he was a baby, I went to graduate school, and there was a time I was standing on top of my American history professor's desk, and he liked it. I was a ham presenting on the history of Jim Crow, and he wound up suggesting I go to graduate school and pursue a Ph.D. So you never know what might change in your life. I would not have predicted I'd become a historian, and along those lines, I wouldn't have predicted how many different paths you can take as a historian.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in grad school? I think some folks on the call are probably contemplating grad school for history, and so it's always nice to hear a little bit about what your experiences were like. How did you decide on research topics? Maybe a little bit about your dissertation. Tell us about your grad school years.
The interesting thing is, so I started grad school when my son was a baby. So I became a pro at time management, and at SNU. At SNHU, I often have students who are parents and have come back to school after a long time, and I can relate to that because I did the same thing, and I came back an even stronger student. But in history, my background in journalism and theater really helped. So my theater background helped in terms of not just teaching, but in public history, right, and making presentations and engaging an audience. And my background in journalism helped because in history, you have to be able to write accurately on deadline, similar to when you're in journalism. So in terms of grad school, I highly recommend it. And a lot of people think, oh, I'll do it later. I'm working full time, or I have children, I have a family. But for me, being in graduate school was a great way to blend caring for my children, which I love, spending time with them in the daytime, but then also having intellectual discussions and heated debates with fellow students in graduate school, and then getting published was thrilling. So for me, graduate school was a perfect thing to do while blending other work and family.
And that's actually one of the biggest challenges with grad school is trying to achieve a balance with your non-grad school life, because most grad school, like PhD programs, are designed it's immersive. You are basically, that's your life. And so, like when I was in grad school, you would do your research, you would take classes, but you would also teach. And so, between all of that, teaching, reading, taking classes, doing your own individual dissertation research, I mean, that's a full-time job right there, which is why my university actually forbid us from having outside work because they didn't want it interfering with our studies. So it's a very immersive thing. I was married during grad school, and I ended up my son was born towards the end when I was working on the dissertation. But it's hard to find that balance, to still keep an outside life going at the same time, because grad school is constructed to basically take over your life for the 4, 5, 7 years that you're part of it.
Yeah, and honestly, I could have stayed in school forever. I loved it. I loved everything about the intellectual discourse, research, interacting with professors and students, and the switch in history in particular, where graduate school is different in history from some other fields like education, where in graduate school for history, you are the ones who lead the seminar, right? And there's a tremendous amount of responsibility and a lot of personal growth and intellectual growth that takes place. So I found it so exciting. And I'm glad that I get to continue with that, with intellectual discovery as an instructor. I could do that. I could, be connected with university life for all of my life.
Oh yeah, my friends and I always joke that I'm on year 35 of college, something along those lines. So yeah, it becomes a lifelong thing. Yeah, even if you're in a different role from a student to an instructor, a professor, it's still college, and you're still learning. You're still getting to know people and doing more research and teaching, and it is quite exhilarating. So you mentioned that your dissertation was published as a book. So tell us a bit about that project. How did you decide on this topic? Who is Marjorie Harris Carr? And, why publish a book, and why write a dissertation and then publish a book about her?
I live in Gainesville. I'm a Gainesville native, Gainesville, Florida, and it's in north central Florida. So it's not the Florida most people envision when they think about the Sunshine State. We're a couple of hours from any beach, right? We're in the center of the state, which during hurricane season is helpful, not being on the coast. But Marjorie Carr was a scientist when women were not permitted to participate in the field. She was a zoologist. She had a master's degree. She was published, and she wanted to get a Ph.D. in ornithology. And when she applied to Cornell, which had the top ornithology program in the 1930s, the director, Arthur Allen, told her point blank, right, that women were not welcome in the field. So my interest in Marjorie Carr is primarily in the fact that she represents women in the professions, right? In this case, women scientists who had to carve out new ways to interact in their chosen field because there were so many barriers to prevent women from working full-time in science. The interesting thing is, for women scientists, marriage in the early to mid 20th century, marriage was considered professional suicide. But Marjorie Harris, as she was at the time, met Archie Carr, who is, his name is synonymous with sea turtle research. They met in a lab at the University of Florida campus, and it was love at first sight. They were married more than 50 years and had 5 children together. And instead of becoming, representing professional suicide, Marjorie Harris's marriage to Archie Carr provided her later on with support. So he supported her activist career when environmentalists, when ecology became an activist field in the 1960s and 70s. He supported her intellectually, lending his name to her projects, and financially, right? Because she wasn't able to be employed full-time in science because she was a woman. So Marjorie Carr's life is this interesting contrast between restrictions on gender and finding these cracks to create a career, in this case, an activist career, grounded in the science of zoology and ecology. And in terms of writing about her, so American history is my major field for my PhD, but my minor field, outside minor was education. My inside minor was the history of women and gender. And I was actually the first student to complete a PhD at University of Florida with that field. So her life represented what is often overlooked, right? So it's a way of examining women not as something on the margins, but something at the mainstream, right, of American history. And I just found it to be fascinating. Plus, my mother grew up with Marjorie and Archie Carr's eldest child and only daughter, Mimi Carr, and she let me scan photos that hadn't been looked at in years. There was a series of love letters that had resealed, the envelopes had resealed with time and humidity in Florida. So I was provided with access to documents, images, and also I conducted oral history interviews with scientists, including one who was involved with the Manhattan Project, which relates to my other topic tonight. So basically, you open one door and another one, and another one, and another one open as well.
Was she operating at the same time that Rachel Carson was working on Silent Spring and all that, or did she come a little bit later?
She's a slightly younger, well, but it really was the same time. And when Marjorie Carr was raising money for her most famous project, which is to save the Ocklawaha River by stopping construction of the Cross Florida Barge Canal, the funding, when people would donate money for the project, was originally called the Rachel Carson Fund. So basically, both Marjorie Carr and Rachel Carson and Marjorie Stoneman Douglas were these so-called little old ladies in tennis shoes, right? They were looked at derisively by pesticide companies, the Army Corps of Engineers. They were written off as these extremist women. But actually, they were serious scientists and activists and writers who helped to make change in Florida history, environmental history, and American history.
Yeah, the gender aspect to the environmental movement is interesting. My dissertation was on environmental legislation in California, and one of the subtopics was the preservation of the San Francisco Bay Area, the bay itself, because with development, the bay had been getting infilled, so the bay was getting much smaller than it had ever been naturally, quote unquote naturally. But the movement to save the San Francisco Bay was led by three middle-aged women who were they were having coffee, and one of them looked out and said kind of a passing comment about, notice that the bay is getting smaller, and then that launched this whole movement to protect the bay from being infilled and from construction and all of that. And so it's interesting that that was the thrust of the dissertation went in a very different direction, but I was always kind of interested by kind of the intersection of gender and environmental preservation in areas like that. So it's interesting to hear you talk about Carr and Rachel Carson and Stoneman, and so it's interesting potential project for somebody to pursue. if someone's looking for a dissertation topic, I think that might be productive.
Oh yes, it is fascinating, those conversations, right? The informal beginnings of movements. But there's John Muir receives so much credit for environmental and conservation work out west, when it was actually thousands of women in Audubon societies and similar groups across the nation that were the foot soldiers of the conservation movement. And that has gotten more attention in recent years, but it's often overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were the ones with the massive letter writing campaigns and all of that. Yeah, so that's a Fascinating topic. We could probably talk for the whole hour on that. But I know you also wanted to talk about another woman who made history. And so tell us about Carolyn Beatrice Parker. Who is she, and why is she so interesting?
So in addition to working in academia, I have worked as a public historian. I've been very lucky to do so. When I was close to finishing my dissertation, I worked at the Florida Humanities. It used to be called the Florida Humanities Council, based in St. Petersburg. And it was an amazing opportunity because there were top scholars who they would hold these seminars to rejuvenate public school teachers and to educate them on topics in Florida history. And anyway, I was lucky to have that experience. And then later in public history, I served as the executive director of the Matheson History Museum in Gainesville. And I had never heard of Carolyn Beatrice Parker. Then the pandemic happened. And I was appointed to a committee. The school board, the Alachua County School Board, had voted to change the name of a school building from 1939 that was named for a Confederate brigadier general who, as a judge, had participated in controversial decisions, including ordering not a hanging, but ordering a lynching of an African-American man who was accused of a crime and forced through corporal punishment to confess. So again, this is 2020. It was early in the pandemic. I hadn't gone to any public meetings, and I found myself at the school board about to meet with these other appointees. And I positioned myself as well as I could between where I thought people, chairs where people would sit. And then a woman came and sat right next to me, and it was a little horrifying, right early in the pandemic. But through a series of fascinating meetings that were, most of them were by Zoom, I foolishly agreed to investigate every proposed name to become the new name for the school that had been named J.J. Finley for the Confederate Brigadier General. And another committee member agreed to investigate all the non-person names. So some people thought that if a Confederate general could become controversial, any person, alive or deceased, could become controversial, and that we shouldn't name buildings for people at all. So there were proposals to name the school Flower or Daisy, or just the street number, right, for the school. So when I was researching this long list of names, there were 3 University of Florida physics professors who had nominated Carolyn Beatrice Parker. And doing research during the pandemic was challenging, right? You can't visit archives. But I was able to look at, using my Ancestry.com account, look at Parker and her relatives, birth records, death records. I found her MIT thesis, master's thesis, was available. It had a brief biographical sketch. And the fact that a Black woman living in Gainesville, Florida, born and died and buried here, had participated in the Manhattan Project as really a hidden figure before the hidden figures of the space age. And nobody had addressed her, right? There are no statues, there is no public history. Nobody was learning about her accomplishments. It was just an exciting opportunity. So being part of that committee was a powerful experience.
And so what happened with the committee?
There finally came a moment where everybody sort of made the case for whom they would like the building to be named after. And I waited till the very end, right? And let everybody talk about what they wanted before I mentioned Parker. And the idea of naming the building for a person was still considered controversial. So I had done some research that I didn't share until this moment, right? And I used my theatrical background and my historian's research background and made the case that I'd be happy to, agree with the idea of not naming a building for a person once there was one school in Alachua County, one Alachua County public school named for a Black woman, because there wasn't one, not a single one. And again, somebody said we should look to the Native Americans and they don't name things for people. And I said, well, actually, Betty Jean Tiger Jumper, who was the first and only elected woman who was elected the tribal chair of the Seminole tribe of Florida, the first and only in the nation, right? But she, there was a building under construction at that time, a hospital in South Florida named for her. So that wasn't true, right? And in the end, unanimously, the committee voted to name the school for this amazing woman who was the first known Black woman to receive a graduate degree in physics. She was a product of Florida's segregated public school system, followed her father's dream, went to Fisk University, where she graduated magna cum laude, went on to the University of Michigan, where she got a master's in physics, and then to MIT, where she received a second master's degree in physics on the way to completing a Ph.D. She didn't complete the Ph.D., and her family thinks it was a combination of the fact that after World War II, Parker continued to work in atomic energy for the US government, and in addition, likely during World War II, when she was working on the Dayton Project, which was part of the Manhattan Project, she was working with polonium, a highly radioactive element. And her family thinks that's why she later developed leukemia and multiple sclerosis and died at the age of 48. So she's buried in the historic Mount, Pleasant Church, cemetery that is on Northwest 13th Street in Gainesville, Mount Pleasant. And she comes from this amazing family where her paternal grandmother was enslaved. Eliza Caro moved to Alachua County, where Gainesville is, sometime after emancipation in 1865. Built a home in the Pleasant Street neighborhood, a historically African American neighborhood that was established during the Reconstruction period, and sold Avon products so that her son Julian, Dr. Julius Parker, could become the first Black doctor in the Gainesville area, one of the first Black doctors. So it's this fascinating history that now will be better known with an elementary school named for Carolyn Beatrice Parker.
And how much were you able to find out about her wartime activities? Were you able to figure out what her exact contributions were to the Manhattan Project or the Dayton Project? Well, first, and I guess you could also say, what is the difference between, I know the Dayton Project is probably a component of the Manhattan Project, but what were they trying to do and how did she contribute to that? Do you know?
Right, so the Dayton Project was located in Dayton, Ohio, and the Manhattan Project proper, right, the classic work that we consider took place in Chicago. There were different scientists working on different components. Most of them did not even realize that they were working on an atomic weapon. And it's an interesting point, right? Because there was actually some resistance. After the unanimous vote, somebody said we shouldn't name the school for a woman who participated in the Manhattan Project. But actually, most of the scientists in the Manhattan Project had no clue, again, that they were working on the atomic weapon or that it would be used in Japan. The idea was that the United States had to counter an atomic weapons program in Nazi Germany, and that was the intended use for any atomic weapon. But in HIS 100, which I taught for many years, originally there was a project that there were no choices for the final research project. Everybody would research some aspect of atomic weapons.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, during World War II. And one thing that was really interesting, a primary source, was the Leo Szilard petition, where he petitioned President Truman shortly before the atomic weapons were used in Japan, imploring Truman to not use the weapon in Japan, which was never its intended use, but instead use it as an incentive to get Japan to surrender, again, without using the weapons. So in terms of getting it back to Carolyn Parker and what she was doing, it was top secret work, right? Her family isn't sure what she was doing. What we do know is that in the Dayton Project, this is according to the Atomic Heritage Foundation, polonium was what was used. It was purified and separated to be used as an initiator for atomic bombs. So it was lax. The use of any safety measures were extremely lax. So that's the extent. We don't know. Like Parker's family cannot say with certainty exactly what she was doing, but we know that she was involved in the Dayton Project, and we know that she continued to be involved in atomic energy studies, again, with her expertise in physics. And working in physics, right, working with atomic energy related to the U.S. government, while also working on the Ph.D. dissertation, it just took time away from her studies. But in terms of Parker, her contributions, the contributions of African Americans who were working on the project, remain lesser known. Somebody contacted me a couple of years ago about doing a documentary, I think it was for the History Channel, where they were going to discuss Carolyn Parker for something like 1.2 seconds, right? And that was huge, that she would get that recognition. But as anyone who has read the book or seen the movie Hidden Figures knows, it's a compelling story, right? This would be another interesting prequel to the Hidden Figures story.
Yeah, because when you think about kind of the broader context of what's happening, of course, yes, she's operating in segregated America during wartime, and so you've got a situation where you've got lots of scientists working on this, and their acts are all, or their research is all confidential, of course, anyway. So there's lots of researchers attached to various components of the Manhattan Project that we really don't know we have no idea what they were doing because it's still classified. But then, yeah, you put on top of it the idea that a lot of agencies are not going to advertise that they're using, that they've got black scientists working for them, because that was, in Ohio, not that big of a deal, I suppose. I mean, there's still racial resentment even in northern states, but it didn't have the same legal segregation as in the South. But there's lots of Southern congressmen who might get upset about, federal money being used where black scientists are employed. And so, yeah, there's a lot of kind of bigger context to the story that really would make for a really fascinating reenactment, whether it's as a monograph or a biography or a History Channel documentary or whatever. But yeah, there's a lot going on there that would be fascinating to kind of work with.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to me because my dissertation, my book was on the challenges that women scientists face at this time, right, early to mid 20th century. To add on top of that, being a black female scientist, there's so many additional hurdles and challenges. And the fact that she was able to go from Florida's segregated education system, her father could only go to the 8th grade in Gainesville. There was a school, Union Academy, which was a Freedmen's Bureau school. And of course, it was intentional that stopped at the 8th grade to prevent African Americans from advancing educationally. But his mom, again, who had been enslaved and wanted more than anything to provide a quality education for her son, sold Avon products in the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? She financed his way, so he went to what was then Clark Atlanta University to complete a high school degree, right? That's what it took, that type of determination and financial savvy, right? So then he had, Dr. Parker had 5 children who all went on to complete at least a bachelor's degree. And in terms of the eldest, right, the firstborn, Carolyn, she followed her father's footsteps, went to Fisk, and ultimately became in 1947 an assistant professor of physics at Fisk. So within the race segregated educational system, she went as high as becoming a professor, but also became the first Black woman known to get an advanced degree in physics, both at University of Michigan and at MIT, and came close to completing a Ph.D. So it's an incredible life, and it would be interesting to see if someone were able to navigate, these confidential, top secret, formerly confidential records that may or may not exist on that aspect of the Dayton Project, and to focus on Parker and these other African American scientists who defied the odds and did their patriotic duty during World War II with the goal of defeating the Nazis, beating them in the atomic energy race.
Right, because I mean, at the time, yes, the Nazis were trying to develop their own. I mean, the general concept of an atomic bomb had been known actually fairly well in the physics community for a decade or two before World War II, and so it's not like this was a new invention that suddenly everyone was trying to. But it's really hard to do is the problem. It's a fairly simple, as I understand it. I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm not in tune with all the physics part of it, so I could be totally wrong. But as I understand it, it's actually a fairly simple device but it's just manufacturing the device to be because you have to be very precise. You have to have a certain type of radioactive material to use, and so it's hard to pull off. It's kind of like the analogy I always did when I was teaching face to face was the idea of putting someone into orbit. In theory, it's not difficult to put someone into orbit, but in reality, it's really hard to put someone into orbit because you have to pick like a certain spot in the sky and aim and hit that spot, and that's hard to do. And so it's kind of like with a nuclear weapon. It's like Jeremy says in the comments, it's not so hard to build to conceptualize, but it's very difficult to control. It's very difficult to build, and the control part is interesting because there's the story about scientists as they were about to detonate the first test bomb. There were scientists who were afraid that the nuclear detonation just wouldn't end, and eventually it would just consume the entire universe if we started this chain reaction. It's just going to destroy everything. Thankfully, it didn't. Right, but they still did it anyway. So yeah, it's. But it is still definitely worth talking about the people that were involved in it, and this one having kind of the kind of an intersection of race and gender is fascinating, and it's really incredible that you found it. It's really incredible, I think, that those physics instructors at that college nominated her in the first place, because you got to wonder if they hadn't nominated and you hadn't picked up on it, how much longer would the story have not been told? And so it's which is just another example of kind of the happenstances of history of how this stuff kind of, we're not even looking for it sometimes, and it just kind of falls into our laps, and suddenly, boom, we've got something really cool to talk about.
Exactly. Another interesting thing when I was doing my research, I looked, of course, at Wikipedia, and the Wikipedia page frustrated Parker's nieces. I interviewed two of her nieces. And there was so much misinformation, they said, on that Wikipedia, the original Wikipedia entry. Erroneous information about her, about her father, all kinds of incorrect information. And so it shows the power of Wikipedia, because the only other things that had been published at the time, so 2020, included in an MIT Black History Month spotlight on their alumna, right? Carolyn Parker, where they didn't even try to work the information from Wikipedia into a new article. They excerpted it exactly as it was, and it's still there today if you look it up. And so it's all that misinformation. Then there was a Forbes magazine article that continued to perpetuate that misinformation. So in terms of like teaching students about history and accuracy and why it matters, that one Wikipedia entry led to multiple other publications spreading misinformation. And it's so much harder to curtail that than it is to just start with an accurate representation at the beginning. There was even I forget the name now. I think it was like a Black physician's site from the past that said that that had the wrong picture. It had the picture of a different scientist who was clearly not working in physics, right? It was chemistry or something. And her picture was wrong. So there were committee members who we contacted these organizations to try to get these mistakes corrected. And we also worked on editing the Wikipedia page. I see Jeremy says Wikipedia is a dirty word in my house.
And that's one of the big skills that historians and history adjacent fields, I know we've got some anthro folks in here, and so there's not everybody in the audience is a history major, but everyone's kind of tangentially related to history, I think. But that is one of the skills of the historian that everybody has to learn, is how to figure out. I mean, you've got to trust but verify. You've got to basically fact check everything you find, because Wikipedia. Jeremy says it's a dirty word. I mean, Wikipedia has its uses in that it can be good to help you to establish kind of a general context. It can help you to establish timelines, and it can help to identify maybe some of the names of people you should look up for a project. But again, like you said, it's not accurate. It's not always accurate. And so you have to verify that the stuff you're getting from there is accurate. I mean, it's just like, we've been having a long conversation, and everybody in the world is having a long conversation about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and all of that, because those things can create some really good looking writing, but you never have any idea if any of it is correct. I did a seminar for instructors at SNHU a year or two ago on ChatGPT, where I asked it a question about Frederick Douglass, and I basically had everybody watch it write this essay that looked really cool. It was really well written. It cited sources using footnotes. It looked really beautiful, but the quotes that it was giving, Frederick Douglass said ... Those quotes didn't exist. It just made them up. And I know this because it said that it was pulling it from the Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which is a book that I've assigned to students for 20 years now. And so I know that book inside and out. I'm like, this quote is not here. And so I tore the book apart, and the quote wasn't there. I just completely invented it. And so that's the problem that we have with things like AI and Wikipedia and all of that, is because it was a great sounding quote, and the quotes perfectly answered the question that I had put into ChatGPT, but it didn't actually exist. And so that type of thing happens all the time with Wikipedia, because again, Wikipedia is done by, it's crowdsourcing, and crowdsourcing gets it wrong. And you made an interesting comment about having the wrong picture attached to somebody's page, and I've come across that numerous times when I'm putting together like PowerPoint slides for presentations and stuff. I'll be like, okay, I just need to find a picture of this person, and so you go online and you've got like a whole bunch of one, and then there's like a second one that's slightly off, and you're like, wait a minute. And so you actually figure out that, that's actually that's not even the right guy. But yes, it keeps getting republished because there's so many journalists or other folks that just aren't interested in fact checking, that they just click copy and paste, and they just end up basically repeating the same error over and over again. And that's a problem that historians have to be very aware of, especially those of us in an academic setting. So were you successful in getting the school name changed for Parker?
Yes, it was. What the committee was responsible for doing was reviewing the suggested names from the community, and then researching them and making a recommendation. So the committee recommended Parker and included some, biographical information and to justify the choice, and then sent the recommendation to the school board, and the school board voted unanimously to make the change. So today there's a beautiful new sign at one of Gainesville's oldest public schools that says Carolyn Beatrice Parker Elementary School. There's a park that is both the city of Gainesville and the school board maintain the park, and it also is named for Parker. And it's inspirational because every day hundreds of students go to school at Carolyn Beatrice Parker Elementary School, and their namesake is a woman who overcame the tremendous barriers against both her race and her sex. She grew up a mile and a half east of the school, but would not have been able to attend had it been in existence when she was elementary school age, because it served Gainesville's white population for decades before schools in Alachua County were finally desegregated in the middle of the 1969-1970 school year. So it's a tremendous success, right? And in terms of public history, making that kind of impact that lasts is really satisfying.
And I'm glad that you just mentioned public history there, because I mentioned that in your bio, you identify as a public historian, and that's especially for students who are just kind of getting started out in studying history. What do you consider? What is a public historian in your mind? What makes a public historian different from kind of the popular conception of a historian?
That's a great question. When I was the director of the Matheson History Museum, there was, I had to make that transition between simply is a good word, exclusively being a professor and then working with the public. So when you're working with the public, there are diverse groups of people who will come to the museum or for whom you have to plan programming. And you have to think about many different ways to reach the public. One thing that I promised in my job interview for the position was that I would use my background in writing and journalism to publish a series of local history articles in local magazines. And that's something I've done for years and really enjoyed. Also, in terms of the combining theater and history, I managed a public program, a speaker series, where we would bring in historians from around the state. Sometimes we focused on the history of the blues in Florida or other musical topics, and we would have live music. And we take on tough conversations, such as there were lynchings in the area, such as the Rosewood 1923 infamous lynching that inspired a movie that also was by John Singleton, that was partly fictional. It involved some, took some creative license. In 1916, there was a series of lynchings known as the Newberry lynchings, and that is also within Alachua. That's in Alachua County. So in terms of public history, you lose that element of control that you have with writing or teaching. You don't know how your audience will react, right? Whether that's an audience in a public program or people who come into the museum. I remember once we had an exhibit on the desegregation of Alachua County public schools, and a gentleman came in who was actually pictured on the wall, and he had raised a Confederate flag at Gainesville High School during desegregation, and he was very upset with the way he was depicted in a museum label. So it's an exciting way of engaging with the public that blends academic research and writing with interactions that are often unpredictable with the public.
And good. And so, can you tell us a little bit more about what it's like working in the museum industry? And just since there may be some students who are interested in getting into that field, what do you think about kind of entering into that career? What are some good paths to take to get into the museum world?
So what I would recommend, there are museum programs that focus on, so there are degrees in museum studies. University of Florida has a program, but I felt equipped to work at a history museum with my history degree. In fact, I felt it was an advantage, right? So I was the first historian to become director. Now, as a director, right, you have to blend all kinds of things, from fundraising, seeking grants, managing grants, grant reports, to the creative stuff, right, planning programs and exhibits. And you have to do things that often you wouldn't imagine, especially with a small museum, whether it's renting out or even cleaning the porta potties at a reenactment to could be, raising money for the budget, holding museum galas. But again, for history, I don't know that I would recommend that you get an additional degree in museum studies. I think that there's tremendous value to a history degree that can be applied whether you're working at a library or archives or museum and engaging with academics and the public in different ways. A history degree is invaluable because you're able to identify exactly, what an argument is, right, or what good evidence is, and in a museum exhibit, being able to identify that and get it down from an article or a thesis into one little label is a great exercise in writing. So my advice to people who are interested in museums, actually my top bit of advice would be to volunteer, because it is very common for museums to hire people who begin as volunteers. Interns, yes, but also simply volunteers.
Yeah, that's good advice that I have heard from other folks that are in the museum industry also, is you just kind of get your foot in the door and then just kind of go from there. It's it's not one of those fields that you go into looking to make a whole lot of money. So you just need to kind of prepare to be ready to do some volunteer work, and then eventually, hopefully, it'll work into something different. But it's a good way to get your foot in the door.
Definitely.
All right. Well, I wanted to make sure that we had time for folks in the audience to ask any questions that they have of any of the stuff that we've been talking about, whether it's public history versus Carolyn Parker or Marjorie Harris Carr or any of the other topics that we've been talking about here. And so if anybody in the audience has any questions or comments for Dr. Macdonald, feel free to either type in the chat box over on the right side of the screen, or you're welcome to activate your cameras or your microphones and speak up. So yeah, Kayla is asking, are you working on anything new or exciting now?
Right now, I'm a teaching machine, and that is my focus. But I love it. I think that I've become particularly good at this point of improving my organization and clarity. So that is right now my focus. I'm deliberately not taking on any additional writing projects right now because I'm focusing on my students.
Jasmine is asking a great question. Are there any books that you really recommend people read? I'm assuming, Jasmine, that this is open to any topic, or did you have a specific topic in mind? Open-ended. Oh, wow, that's a good question. Peggy, what do you think? Are there any books that you really recommend people read? I guess another way to phrase this would probably just be what are your favorite history books, I imagine.
Of course, you should read my book, right? No.
Sure.
Actually, I was really lucky in graduate school. One of my professors, who has a tremendous sense of humor and is just so supportive, nice guy, happened to win the Pulitzer Prize. His name is Jack Davis, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Gulf, which does something different, right? So in terms of writing environmental history, he focuses on the long history, the American history, right, of the Gulf of Mexico. And it's fascinating. He and his friend Cynthia Barnett are both environmental writers who have made choices with their recent books to focus on appealing to as many people as possible. Jack Davis's follow-up book to The Gulf is called Bald Eagle. That's exactly what it sounds like. It's a history of the bald eagle. That's been a fascinating history, right? Almost the bald eagle almost became extinct, and it's one of our great success stories due to environmental protections. So those would be some good starts. In terms of Jack Davis, he also wrote a biography of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas that is equal parts her life story and the history of the Everglades, which she worked to save. So definitely a name to add if you're interested in environmental history and women's history and Florida history, which are three areas I'm fascinated with. But also I thought it was really neat that Dr. Denning mentioned Frederick Douglass and the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, because that's something that has been one of my favorite things to teach as well. And I speak as someone living in Florida, right? People assume that in Florida you can't teach anything, right, controversial, but that book is actually one of the recommended books for 7th graders in Florida public schools. And so it's something I would recommend as well. If you've never read Frederick Douglass, so we're talking a primary source now, but it's his narrative, his autobiography was one of the most successful books of the 1900s.
And that's going to be a rough book for 7th graders.
19th century, my bad. Well, I think it's better for if you have a teacher teaching it, right? Doing a read aloud and stopping for discussions. And then students can choose from a variety of topics of essay choices. And it's a harsh reality, and it's so much better to begin teaching honest history at with younger grades rather than waiting until college.
Yeah, and Jeremy is asking a good question that we can follow up with, but I'll just toss out a couple of books also. For primary sources, your discussion of Frederick Douglass actually made me think about Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs. He has a 2-volume memoir, which is amazing because Ulysses S. Grant, I mean, he's one of my favorite figures of history anyway, so I'm a little bit biased, but his memoirs are very well written. They're funny and they're very candid. He was a very easygoing guy, and so he was very quick to kind of point out his own flaws. He would talk about the things he did well, but he would do it in kind of an aw shucks way, but then he would also dwell on the stuff he did wrong, and so it creates a really interesting. It's a great story. I am a little bit. My focus has always been on Reconstruction, and he spends very little time talking about the post-war period when he was president for some reason. He doesn't talk much about that, which is kind of a bummer to me. But if you're looking for wartime stuff about the Civil War, his memoirs are amazing. And then for historians, the one book that I recommend all students read, if only to get yourself all worked up about what history can do, is Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. It's 50 years old at this point. I mean, and it's very dated. I apologize for my dog barking in the background. It's very dated. It's very opinionated, and it violates almost all of the cultural norms of the historian. But it's an amazing book because it's just written. It can show you the power of storytelling. And there's lots of complaints against it. It's biased, and you can tell it's biased just by looking at any page in the book. It's not perfect, but it's an amazing read, and it'll get you fired up about history in a way that very few other books can. So I always recommend people check that one out. Even my conservative friends who just despise anything about Zinn, I would say just check it out because it'll fire you up, and you'll want to prove it wrong. And something that gets you fired up to the point where you want to prove it wrong, that's pretty amazing just in itself. So anybody should check it out, even if you think you're going to hate it. So I recommend that one. Jeremy's also asking a question. As someone that is going to be finishing grad school in June in American history at nearly 50, I'm assuming that means 50 years old, any advice for getting out in the field as a job after completing grad school? This would be a second career as he retired from the military, hence the late start. Any thoughts on that?
I started graduate school when I was almost 30 and had my first child. And so by the time I finished, I was in my late 30s. And in 1 year, I had my second child, finished my Ph.D. and got married to my husband. So there was a lot going on, but my point being, so basically after my PhD, I was middle-aged, right? And I found it to be an advantage with the different nonprofit work that I pursued. So in terms of the museum world, right? Museum opportunities, somebody who is mature is going to be in demand. Also, often men are in demand, especially with a focus on military history, like you mentioned. So what does that mean? It doesn't have to be a museum. It can be working in the park service, right? So the state or the federal park service, historians are in demand because you need to interpret the land, right? Whether it's on a tour or for visitors at the visitor center, that is a good career option. In addition, teaching, right, which doesn't have to be teaching in academia, right, but teaching in public schools. Teachers are greatly in demand, and people love to say how low the pay is, but the fact is, with an advanced degree, you are paid more because of your education. In addition, the perks of being a school teacher include often a week at Thanksgiving, 2-week winter holiday, a week at spring break, and 2.5 or so months in the summer, and other holidays. I'm telling you, those things, the quality of life and being able to interact with students when you're passionate about history. I also find that you don't even have to teach history, right? There's a far greater demand for teachers of English, right? Reading language arts. And that's all history is. So if you're interested in teaching, you don't have to limit yourself to higher education, right? There's a great demand for public school teachers, and don't listen to what everyone says about the pay, right? You have to look into where you live. In addition, for nonprofits, right? So you have tremendous skills as someone with a graduate degree in history, skills at identifying what a document says, knowing what it means. When I finished my Ph.D., I wound up briefly working at a power company, which is funny because I had written an environmental dissertation. And there was a team of engineers gathering around trying to figure out what this important paper meant. Somebody had issued a decree. Nobody could figure out what it meant. And because of the training in history, I was able to immediately say, interpret the document. And it was useful. So a history degree is useful to so many fields. I could talk about it all day.
I will also use this as an opportunity to plug a project that I've been working on for the last few years, the Working Historians podcast series, where I interview historians in a bunch of different career fields. And at this point, I've got 130-ish episodes up there. So feel free to check that link that I just posted in the chat, and you can just scroll through it and see what episodes you find. I tried to identify in the titles like what the actual career is, and so that may be a starting point too. You can just kind of scroll through and see what look for folks that are in careers that might interest you. And the questions we always talk about is, how did you get into the field? And so that might be a good starting point. So feel free to start browsing through that. This event that we're in right now will eventually show up on that feed also, and so you'll see all of this there. And I think I'll just use this opportunity to thank everybody. So thank you, Peggy, for coming and talking to us for an hour. And it was great to hear about your research, and I hope I wish you the best on your future projects. Thank you to everybody in the audience for coming to listen to us talk for a while here. I will mention that our next history speaker event will be on December 5th, 2024 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, where David Valadares, who is an instructor at SNHU, will talk about his recent book titled England's Response to Hitler in the 1930s, Empire, Appeasement, and the Cliveden Set. And we will start distributing the registration link for that in our various channels. So please, if you're interested, register for that, and hopefully we will see you all then. So in the meantime, again, thank you all for coming out. Have a great evening, and hopefully we'll talk to you all soon. And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast or any of our other podcasts, please write to workinghistorians@gmail.com. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Pandora, or whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear about all the other cool stuff that historians do with their lives. As always, this podcast does not represent the views of Southern New Hampshire University. For Peggy Macdonald, I'm Rob Denning. Be good to yourselves and each other.